Alright, so today I want to introduce you to the disco ball python. And let me tell you, when I was putting this video together, I found there was limited information on the internet about the disco ball python. As a matter of fact, a lot of the information is actually incorrect. A lot of the information that I'm going to cover in this video will correct some of the misinformation out there on the disco. And I'd say the disco is a pretty hard sell when it comes to ball python morphs. If you think about mixing with other combos, you have genes like the champagne, which is really visually dominant, and it kind of masks everything you mix with it. You pretty much ended up with a washed out champagne. And I would say the disco is the complete polar opposite of the champagne. When you actually mix disco into some snakes, you can't even tell that disco is in the mix in a lot of cases. And I want to show you the potential and some of the downfalls and some of the confusion behind the disco. Alright, so I'm going to jump back and forth between the world of ball pythons and morph market. And this is what a disco looks like. As a matter of fact, it looks really close to just a normal ball python. Some of these pictures almost look slightly like a fire. There's actually only two pictures. I'd say this one looks pretty close to a fire. As a matter of fact, I went over on morph market, and a lot of people are listing their snakes as this is either a normal or a disco. A lot of times you can't even tell a difference between a disco and a normal. And I wanted to show you over here, first they actually have a super disco. If you breed two discos together, you get a super disco, and you can definitely tell there's quite a big visual difference between the disco and the super disco. I actually pulled this one up. There's only one picture over here on the world of ball python, so I decided to come over here on morph market. This is what a mature adult super disco looks like. You can definitely tell that. You can definitely tell that from a normal. That is a pretty impressive snake. And when I think of disco, there's only really one combo that I think of, and that is the disco inferno. And that is the disco mixed with a fire. Makes a really impressive snake. I'd say it's probably the most impressive disco that you can get. This is actually just a fire. I wanted to show you the fire first before we mix in the disco. And the fire, you can actually tell it's a little bit different than the normal. I actually hatched out some fires this year, and you can definitely tell it has some color in there. Definitely different color and pattern than a normal. The funny thing is a lot of times you're looking through different pictures over here on Morph Market or the World of Ball Pythons, and sometimes you can't tell the difference because you're looking at maybe two different lines or different versions of a normal. But let me tell you, if you have a whole clutch of hatchlings just right out of the egg, and you look at the normals, you look at the fires, you can definitely tell side by side. You can easily differentiate the fires from the normals. And this is what happens when you mix fire with disco. I'd say hands down, this disco inferno is probably the most impressive combination that you will get with the disco. As a matter of fact, if you're looking into the disco project and you actually bought into it, I can almost guarantee you probably bought a disco inferno, because it's probably the most impressive snake. And just kind of scrolling through these pictures, you can see that a lot of them have this white on it. It almost looks like there's some pied influence in there, although there's no pied at all. It's just kind of one of those combinations that has almost like a pied marker through it. Looks like it has these little splotches of white. And remember, pied is recessive, and both of these are actually co-dominant. So it's interesting how they work together to actually kind of form the pseudo-pied. I've actually seen a lot of combos with the champagne that actually have this kind of a pseudo-pied mix. As a matter of fact, if you mix het pied with champagne, you get a lot of pied looking snakes, which is kind of interesting. So the interesting thing about the disco inferno is that a lot of people, there's a lot of confusion on whether it's allelic or not. So if you're not familiar with allelic, essentially it's a genetic term. If it's allelic and you breed this to another snake, half the babies come out disco, half the babies come out fire. But if it's not allelic, you can actually get some disco babies, some fire babies, some disco inferno offspring, and you can also get some normal wild type classics. It is completely different when you're looking at the genetics. As a matter of fact, there's one person on one of the YouTube channels, he got on there and he's like, I went over to this genetic calculator and everybody says this is allelic, and I checked it out and it's actually not. And let me show you what he's talking about. So if you actually come over here to the world of ball pythons, to the genetic wizard, you actually type in the disco fire and you cross it with a normal, you hit calculate. This is actually what it says you get. You actually get a disco inferno, a disco, a fire, and a normal, which means that it is not allelic. Well, let me tell you, I know for sure that this is actually allelic. There's a lot of people that are breeding disco infernos, and a lot of people say that it's definitely illegal. So there's actually a second genetic calculator where you can check your results from the calculator. So I went over here actually to the Morph Market calculator. You plug in disco fire and you hit go, and this is what you get: 50% disco, 50% fire. So you see that actually the genetic calculator on the world of ball pythons is actually incorrect, which is kind of interesting. This is the first time where I've actually seen a flaw in that calculator. I've pretty much used that as my gold standard for every genetic calculation that I've done. So it's kind of interesting that in this case it's actually incorrect. So here's another gene that's kind of interesting. I've actually have never talked about the sulfur gene. I'd say the sulfur is a really subtle morph. It's almost similar to the disco, where you can hardly even tell the difference between a sulfur and a normal. And the interesting thing about sulfur, I almost got into the project because of the super sulfur. And I actually pulled up a picture here. Take a look at this. This is the super sulfur. It is a really quite visually stunning snake. I'd say I don't even think you can get this kind of a snake with any other combo besides the super sulfur. It's pretty interesting. So this is what happens when you actually mix the disco with the sulfur. You get a really interesting snake. And the interesting thing about the disco sulfur is there's also a lot of debate whether this is allelic or not. So I actually went back over to the world of ball pythons, the genetic calculator, plugged it in, and well, first before we actually go over the calculator, this is kind of what tipped me off, is someone actually listed over here in Morph Market a spider, sulfur, or disco. And usually if someone says it's one gene or another, that means it actually came from an allelic combination. So if it wasn't allelic, essentially what they would say, this is spider, possible sulfur, possible disco, or possibly neither, which should be kind of interesting. And in this case it said sulfur or disco. So I was like, that kind of looks like it's allelic. So I came over here to the world of ball pythons genetic wizard. Now I actually put in disco sulfur crossed with the normal, and here is what I got. Again, a disco sulfur, and normal, indicating that it is not an allelic combination. But believe it or not, this one is actually incorrect as well. It is actually allelic. You come over here to Morph Market, the genetic calculator, you plug it in, and sure enough, 50% disco, 50% sulfur for the results, indicating it is actually allelic. So I'd say if you're doing some genetic calculations, I would probably go back and forth between these two and make sure to check your results with a second calculator to make sure your results are the same. So here I just wanted to kind of show you some of the possibilities with the disco mixed with some of the most common genes that we normally use for breeding in ball pythons, some of the basic standard bread and butter morphs. This is the spider. The spider is a codominant gene. You actually can't breed two spiders together because it's a lethal combo, and the spider is kind of known for the head wobble. I say a small percentage of spiders have a really severe head wobble. It kind of ruins the whole gene just because a few snakes have a bad head wobble. As a matter of fact, the spider is banned at some of the big reptile shows in the UK. So let me tell you, if you're over here in the United States and you have a spider, you better be lucky and better be thankful that you can actually keep and breed and sell your spiders before someone actually comes in and bans a gene. I hope that never happens over here. So this is what happens if you breed spider with the disco. And I would say, I was kind of looking through some of the the different possibilities as far as the different pictures, and I'm scrolling through and I'm not seeing any difference at all. This is a disco spider and it looks like a regular spider to me. Pretty much little to no difference in the disco spider. Here's the cinnamon. The cinnamon's a dark morph. You actually breed two cinnamons together, you get the super cinnamon, which is an almost all black snake. It's a pretty awesome snake. It looks almost like a normal ball python by itself, but it works really well with a lot of combos. As a matter of fact, when you mix it with the disco, you actually see some pattern changes on the side. So it looks like the disco actually works a little bit pretty well with the cinnamon. I would say the cinnamon disco has some potential. So here is the albino, and you know, the albino is just pretty much an all white and yellow snake with red eyes. Pretty much a lot of times it actually retains most of the normal pattern, but it's just really a color mutation. You actually mix disco with the albino and look what you get. You almost get an albino. It almost looks exactly the same. As a matter of fact, I was scrolling through all the different albino pictures and I couldn't tell the difference between a disco albino and a regular albino. I say if there's differences, they are extremely subtle, and maybe you need a disco expert to actually pick out the subtleties, but I'd say when you mix it in, it's little to no change. So the Mojave is kind of the same as the albino. Actually, was the funny thing about a lot of these genes is actually you can scroll through a lot of different versions of the Mojave. There's some that look completely different than the others. I actually picked this one out because it was close to the disco Mojave, and I really couldn't see that much of a difference. I'd say maybe there's a little bit of blushing up on the top, a little bit of color reduction just right along the top. I'd say there is little to no difference when you mix in disco with the Mojave. Here's the yellow belly, and the yellow belly is, I'd say the yellow belly works well with just about anything. It's a really subtle morph, but when you mix it with stuff, it really, you can definitely tell the yellow belly's in there, and it almost always improves your combos. Yellow belly is an awesome gene. You mix yellow belly with disco, and you can definitely tell there's only one picture here. You can definitely tell there is definitely some more highlights and contrast, and you can see a lot of the yellow and the brightness coming out. So it looks like it works pretty well with yellow belly. So here's another one. I actually pulled this up over in Morph Market and I thought this was interesting. This is a disco yellow belly, but it really has a jumbled up pattern like I didn't see in the first example. So I thought that was kind of interesting that sometimes it actually brightens the snake, and in this case it actually affected the pattern quite a bit. Pastel is I'd say the pastel is kind of hard too, because there are so many versions of pastels. There's really bright and really dull, and I actually kind of pulled this one up because if you look over here to the disco pastel, I'd say it's a hard, I'd say you could definitely tell there's a little bit of an influence in here. It looks like it has some blushing up along the top of the snake. I'd say I don't really have a lot of examples of this, but the hard part is there's a whole variety of different pastels, and actually what you really need to do is you actually need to take this specific line of pastel and have a whole bunch of pastels from the same clutch right next to the disco pastels and then see the difference. That's what you really need to do. For me, you know, looking through all these pastels, I would say it was really hard to see, but I could definitely tell in here there's definitely some blushing coming up through the top of the snake. But on the other hand, I've actually had some pastels that had a little bit of blushing. I would say not as severe. This almost looks like as much blushing as a super pastel. So I'd say it definitely has an influence with pastel. Here's an ENCHI, and this is essentially a pattern reduction, and it usually brings out the yellows and golds. It mixes really well with a lot of genes. Probably the #1 gene as far as popularity in the ball python industry. Everything goes better with ENCHI. You can't go wrong if you mix an ENCHI in your collection. And this is what happens when you mix in disco and ENCHI. It's really an interesting. It seems like it even reduces the pattern a little bit more, maybe increases the brightness and the contrast a little bit. So it looks like it does have some effect when you mix the disco with the ENCHI. So here is the lesser. The lesser, I actually have quite a few lessers in my collection. I actually just hatched out a scaleless head lesser, really impressive snake. Really looking forward to making a completely scaleless lesser at some point. You mix the lesser with the disco, and I would say there is probably little to no effect when you mix the disco with the lesser. I can't really see much of an effect on the combo. Here's the pinstripe, and the pinstripe actually does have an effect when you mix it with disco. And if you look at this pinstripe, most of them on the sides, you can see it almost has like these little lines that you'd see almost in some of the spiders. You can actually see on the sides, and pretty much you're scrolling through all these and you look at the sides are pretty clear with these lines going through. It's pretty typical for pinstripe, pretty much a gold snake with this kind of a broken up, sometimes a solid line right down the top. And here's what happens when you mix disco with the pinstripe. Look at the sides on this one. It really jumbles up the sides, which I thought was really interesting. It definitely has an effect when you mix disco with pinstripe. So the clown is probably a hard sell when it comes to just the single straight disco gene. And I was actually looking at some combos I want to show you at the end where clown's mixed in. And you can actually get some impressive combos if you mix more genes on top of just the straight disco. But I'd say when you mix disco and clown, you can't even tell that it's in there. This is just a straight clown. And this picture here is the clown disco. Doesn't really have much of an effect that I can tell just from the two genes. Here's the spot nose, and you can tell the spot nose is kind of an interesting, almost looks like a normal. It works really well with clown. Clown and spot nose work really well together. A lot of the spot noses have a really interesting pattern on the head stamp. You actually mix in, when you mix in disco with spot nose, the pattern on the head changes, which is kind of interesting. And the color changes too, which is really interesting. So you can definitely tell the disco and the spot nose work together. They finally have a visual appearance that is pretty impressive between the two genes. So I thought I'd throw this up because I always have Bobby around my neck. I thought, all right, how does bamboo mix with disco? And this is a disco bamboo, and it really doesn't look like there's a whole lot of difference between the bamboos and the disco bamboos. Of course, it's really hard to tell in the line of bamboos because a lot of them are faded out on the sides. Some of them, actually, what you would really need to do is, again, have a whole clutch of bamboos with the disco and without the discos in the same clutch, from the same pairing, and then see if there's a difference. And I'd say from what I'm seeing here, there's little to no difference in the disco bamboo. So I came over here to Morph Market and actually sorted by all that were for sale and that have sold. And I was just wondering how many discos are over here on Morph Market, and there's actually has been 332 disco ball pythons, quite a few. A lot of people buying into the project, and I'm thinking a lot of people are probably buying the disco infernos and then breeding it with some other stuff. And this is kind of the low end stuff. You can see they're selling for about $50 and plus probably another $50 shipping, so you're looking at probably $100. And a lot of these, I would say, it's really hard to tell the difference between a disco and a normal. Some of them actually were listing them as disco or normals, which is kind of interesting. And then I want to show you two last pictures right at the end. This is kind of the ultimate potential. There wasn't a whole lot to choose from, but these were some of the most interesting combos. And I would say if you're working on the disco project, what you really want to do, in my opinion, is you want to take Disco Inferno as pretty much the building block and then add things on top of that. For example, this is the Disco Inferno with the pastel and the clown on top of it. So this is actually, it's kind of interesting. You almost can't even see the clown in there. It's a really interesting combo, but it's the pastel, disco, fire, clown, and I'm kind of interested to see how much this one's actually selling for. This one is for sale $3,800. I think this is probably one of the highest priced disco combos in all of Morph Market. I actually have one more here at the end. This one's really interesting too. This is actually the Super Disco. So you can actually do the Disco Inferno and add jeans on top of it, or you can do the Super Disco and add jeans on top. I think that is really where the disco shines. This is the Super Disco with the pastel clown on top of it. And that is a really crazy snake. It almost has like this pied kind of a look to it, even though it doesn't have pied in it. And it has almost a faded out head, and the clown pattern, you can really see the clown pattern on this one, which is really interesting. And this one's actually selling for $2,250. So that is pretty much the ultimate potential of the disco. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Nick Verga asks, when I'm pairing up my ball pythons, how often should I check for a lock, and how long do they stay locked for? And that is a very good question. So essentially what we're talking about is when ball pythons are mating, they twist their tails together and lock in a copulation. Sometimes they can lock for hours, sometimes they can lock for days. I'd say most ball pythons will lock for probably about half a day. And this ball python around my neck, this is Bobby, my bamboo ball python. For some reason, when he locks with the females, he will stay locked for days. I don't know what, well, it seems like he's completely different than all my other males. As a matter of fact, I'll cycle all my males through my females, and I'll put them back into the tubs after the 3 days. And then here's Bobby still locked with the males sometimes for another day or two. It is pretty incredible. So when I actually first started in ball pythons, what I would do is I would pair them up for 3 days, and then at the end of the 3 days, I was trying to peek into the tubs to see if they were locked. And the problem is if the snakes are on top of each other, sometimes you're like trying to pick up one snake or moving around to see if they're still locked. And a lot of times I actually interrupted the copulation and separated them. And you definitely don't want to do that in the middle of a copulation. So what I would actually suggest is pair them up for the 3 days. And then at the very end, I'd peek into the tubs. If you know 100% sure that they're completely separated by the tails, make sure the tails are completely separated. It's safe to take the male out. Otherwise, I would leave the male in until you're 100% sure that they are completely apart. And normally what I do, as a matter of fact, in the very first year, I tried to go with like a week and a half rotation, rotating my males through the females. And I ended up going 3 weeks last year. Pretty much, you know, I put them in for 3 days and then give them 3 weeks off. I heard that that is sufficient. And as a matter of fact, I think in about 100 plus eggs, I only had 2 slugs. Two infertile eggs out of all my clutches. It was pretty amazing. And I would say pretty much what you want to do is you want to keep breeding 3 days at a time, every 3 weeks for probably 5 to 6 months until the females start ovulating. And when they ovulate, that's when the eggs are fertilized, and you can actually see they start swelling up like a football really big. And usually once I see my first female ovulating, I pretty much call it quits as far as rotating my males through my females. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.